The 1980s were coming to a close. TSR and the Dungeons & Dragons game have been through their fair share of ups and downs. All eyes were focused on the next decade, and entering the 1990s, the D&D game had to evolve. And with that in mind, on March 1st, 1989, TSR released Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition. Second Edition, the first release for Second Edition were the Player's Handbook, which contained all the rules that a player needed to create and play their character. Similar to what it was like in the First Edition one. However, unlike the First Edition Player's Handbook, the Second Edition one actually included all the combat rules. So that was no longer in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Speaking of the Dungeon Master's Guide, it was more about creating and running campaigns, creating stories, and things like assigning experience points and rewarding treasure, as well as a few options for doing things like creating your own races and classes, your own unique magic items, and things of that nature. As far as monsters go, it was actually the monster supplements were released as Monsters Compendiums, which were actually designed to fit in a 3-ring binder. So they were just loose pages that you would plug into this binder, and they had like black and white artwork, and several of these were actually released. I don't know if the idea necessarily of having the monsters be in a binder was the most successful or the most popular idea. I do know that in 1993, TSR did scrap the Monsters Compendium binders and started releasing actual hardcover Monstrous manuals. Instead of monster manuals, it was now called the Monstrous Manual. As far as the Second Edition Player's Handbook goes, the races that made their way into the Second Edition Player's Handbook were the Dwarf, the Elf, the Gnome, the half-elf, halfling, and humans. So they all made the cut into the Second Edition Player's Handbook. Now, the races were very similar to what they were like in their First Edition counterpart. However, a lot of them actually had their level restrictions raised, so that you could go to higher levels with some of the classes. So, instead of having a lot of them cap at, 8th or 9th level, you had a lot of them races that were able to progress in at least one of their more favored classes a lot further, so they could gain more hit dice and players could get more out of them and have more options with them as they progress throughout their adventuring careers. As far as the classes go, they were actually broken down into 4 separate categories. So they were broken down into the Warrior, which consisted of the Fighter, Ranger, and Paladin, the Wizard class, which consisted of Mages and Specialty Wizards. There was the Priest class, or class type, which had the Clerics, Druids, and then there were Rogues that had Thieves and Bards. So as far as the Warriors go, you had your Fighter, which is sort of like your standard generic fighting type class. They basically were all about just fighting with a weapon and able to use heavy armor. Also in this group were the Paladin, which had a lot of the same abilities as a fighter, the ability to use multiple weapons, the ability to use heavy armor, but they also gained a lot of divine abilities, things like the ability to lay on hands and things of that nature, detect evil and stuff like that. In addition, there was also the Ranger, which was a little bit different. The Ranger was more of like a guardian of the woodland realms, and they focused more on wearing lighter armor and fighting with 2 weapons. So they all got to fight with 2 weapons for free, and but they couldn't do that if they were wearing anything other than like the lightest of armors. Fighters, and being the sort of like the standard generic type, needed a little something, I guess. So what they gave fighters was the ability to specialize in one weapon. So each fighting class got a certain number of weapon proficiencies. And they would spend these proficiencies, so 1 point, to be able to use one particular weapon. A fighter could actually spend a 2nd point on one weapon, and only one weapon throughout the entirety of his adventuring career. But doing so would give him a number of bonuses. So it would give the fighter +1 to attack, +2 to damage, and they would also fight at a higher rate of attacks. So the fighter types would gain more attacks per round as they went up in level, but a fighter that specialized could attack more often than, say, a paladin of the same level. The next class group were the mages or wizards. So what they had were the generalist wizard, but they also had what they referred to as specialist wizards. So in second edition, the schools of magic, or all spells were broken down into different schools of magic. There was illusion, enchantment and charm, conjuration slash summoning, abjuration, necromancy, invocation or evocation, greater divination, and alteration. So a standard wizard could cast spells of any school of magic, but that was pretty much it. That's pretty much all that they had. If you chose to be a specialist wizard, you had to do so based off of what you had for your race and for your ability score. So let's just say you wanted to be a human necromancer, you had to have at least a 16 wisdom. Now what this did was, if you specialized in a school of magic, you would gain one extra spell, or you'd have the ability to cast one extra spell of the school that you specialized in per spell level that you had. You also automatically learn one spell of your chosen school each time you gained a level. And if you wanted to learn spells of your chosen school, you actually had a bonus to do so. In second edition, a wizard would have to roll a percentile check to see if they learned a spell or not. Being a specialist gave you a 15% bonus, so it made it a lot easier to learn the spells that you had as your specialized school. The downside is that each school of magic had an opposition school, or even possibly different opposition schools. So using the necromancer as an example, they cannot cast spells from the illusion or enchantment schools of magic. So though any spells that are illusion spells or enchantment spells are completely out as far as a necromancer goes. And each different school of magic had their own oppositions. Now, the example that they give for the specialist wizards in the second edition Player's Handbook is actually the Illusionalist, which is kind of a throwback, I think, to the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook, in which an Illusionalist was a different type of magic user. In this case, they're sort of just an example of how a specialist would look when you put everything together. The next class type were the priests, and the priests consisted of clerics and druids. So in order to make the divine magic work in a similar way mechanically to arcane spells, they actually broke down or divine spells, I should say, into different, what they called spheres of influence. In total, there were actually 16 spheres, and I'll list them all here as follows. The first sphere was called the All Sphere. Now, the All Sphere doesn't mean all spells. What it means is that any and all priests could cast spells from this sphere. The All Sphere had spells like Bless, Detect Evil, Purify Food and Drink, and things like that. The other spheres were Animal, Astral, Charm, Combat, Creation, Divination, Elemental, Guardian, Healing, Necromantic, Plant, Protection, Summoning, Sun, and Weather. Priests had different accesses to these spheres depending on what type of class they were. There was major access and minor access. With major access, what you could do is you could cast any spell of any level that you had the ability to. So there was no restriction on the highest level of spell you could cast from a sphere that you had major access to. If you had minor access, you could cast spells from first, second, or third level of a sphere that you had minor access to, but nothing beyond third level. Standard clerics, as in the Player's Handbook, had major access to almost every sphere except for plant, animal, weather, and elemental. Clerics had minor access to elemental spells, however they couldn't cast any spells excuse me, they couldn't cast any spells from plant, animal, or weather spheres whatsoever. There were options for priests of specific deities or mythos, which had unique abilities that they could do. However, they tended to have tighter restrictions on what spheres they had major access to. So that was sort of the trade-off. Future supplements would actually have different options for being a priest of a specific deity. Things like Faiths and Avatars book for Forgotten Realms and so on. The second class in the priest schooling was the Druids. So Druids are basically the protectors of the natural world. They're restricted to humans. They also had to be true neutral. They also had less access to spheres than like priests or clerics did. What they had major access to the all sphere, animal, elemental, healing, plant, and weather spheres, and they had minor access to divination. Now, they also had other abilities like the ability to shapeshift and things that made up for their lack of spells. Druids also had a really strict hierarchy, with only a single druid in the campaign world being able to be 15th level or higher. The final group of classes that they had in the Player's Handbook were the rogues. So the rogues consisted of thieves and bards. So the thief was pretty self-explanatory. They basically excelled at stealing things and at hiding in shadows, being stealthy, and disarming traps and opening locks. All thieves had base thieving score or abilities. They were pickpockets, open locks, find and remove traps, move silently, hide in shadows, detect noise, climb walls, and read languages. They began with base scores for each of those, and anytime they would go up in level, they would also gain a total of 30 points that they could distribute amongst the different skills. They could only put 15 points in a single skill per level up, however, so there was a bit of restriction on that. Also modifying a thief's abilities were their race, so whatever race they were had different bonuses and penalties to the different thieving skills, as well as your dexterity. So higher dexterity may make certain things easier. You would also have differences in your skills based off of what type of armor you're wearing. They also had the ability to backstab as well, and so that they were sort of like a secondary fighting unit as well. Now, bards received a drastic overhaul from what they were like in first edition. In first edition, the only way to become a bard was to use the adding a second class feature that I spoke about in my last video, so in part 2 of my retrospective. What they would have to do is they would start off usually you would start off as a fighter, and again you were limited I think to either humans or half-elves. So you would begin play as a fighter, and you would progress through your levels. Now, you had to be above 4th level, but you also had to be below what was called your named level. So for a fighter, they achieved their named level at level 9. So as a fighter, you had to retire from the fighting class between levels 5 and 8. If you were any lower, then you wouldn't qualify to be a bard, and if you were any higher, then you also wouldn't qualify because of the responsibilities of being a named character of like the fighting class, for example. After you retired from being a fighter, you would then have to start progressing in levels of rogue. Now, similarly, you had to be above 4th level as a rogue, and you couldn't be at the named level. Now, named level for rogues in first edition was at 10th level, so you could be up to an 8th level rogue, but you couldn't go any higher. At that point, you would have to retire. At that point, you would have to seek out a group of druids who would begin teaching you the bardic ways. So they would teach you spells from their druid list that you would cast basically as songs. So once you reach that point, you would then start progressing in levels of bard, and you would have all your fighting abilities that you had amassed, you would have all your thieving abilities that you had amassed, and now you would start casting druidic spells as song. In second edition, you could simply play a bard from very first level, so you didn't have to go through any of that. You could simply start off as a bard. Bards excelled in using music and song, as well as the ability to read languages, and they had an extensive knowledge of history. Their music could be used to boost allies in combat, and they could even use their music to counter certain spells if they used the counter option. So those were the races and the classes, but I want to talk about basically the single biggest change in second edition AD&D, which was the combat system. TSR had moved away from the combat charts that they had in first edition, and they introduced what I refer to as the THACO system. Now in both 1st and 2nd edition AD&D, armor classes began with a base number of 10, and any armor and shields that you had, as well as having a good dexterity, would modify your armor class by lowering the number. So an armor class at 10 was bad, an armor class of 0 was pretty good. I mean, that's basically having a suit of full plate and a large shield would give you an armor class of 0. THAC0 itself actually stands for 2-hit armor class 0. THAC0 itself is an okay system once you wrap your head around it, but to make the most of it, you really need the DM to just give you what the armor class is of the enemies that you face. The way that it works is you would take your THAC0, and then you could subtract the armor class of the enemy that you're going up against in order to determine what you need to roll on a 20-sided die to hit. So let's just say you're going up against an enemy with an armor class of 0. Your THAC0 is 15, so if you roll a 15 or higher on a 20-sided dice, then you hit that armor class of 0. Now, THAC0 can be a bit confusing and counterintuitive if you're not given the actual armor class. And what I mean by that, using the above example, if you have a THAC0 of 15 and you roll a 16, sort of like using just simple logical thinking and basic understanding of math, where you were going up against an armor class of 0, you rolled 1 higher than what you needed to hit armor class 0, logically you would think that you hit armor class 1 because it's 1 better than 0. Unfortunately, it works the exact opposite way. So rolling higher than your THAC0 actually hits armor classes that are in the negative numbers. So rolling a 16 would hit armor class -1 instead of hitting armor class 1. Another thing that was sort of confusing about the way THAC0 worked is the way that you applied bonuses and penalties. Bonuses would actually lower your THAC0 and penalties would raise it. So when trying to work out what you needed to roll on a 20-sided die to see if you hit or not, essentially you would have to kind of get your head around the idea that you are subtracting bonuses and adding penalties to that number. Speaking of the rules, it also appears as if the writers themselves weren't really sure what rules they wanted to implement as they were creating the game. The reason that I say that is even the core books are loaded, and I mean absolutely loaded, with a large number of what's called optional rules. So, I expected the DMG to be filled with optional rules, since, there were some things that DMs could use to sort of customize or change the way that they run the game. But even the player's handbook was just absolutely loaded with, tons of optional rules. What this basically meant is, depending on which of these rules that you would use, or that your DMs would use, it makes for completely different experiences with different groups, which makes things a little bit difficult for newer players. Basically, an example that I always used was the initiative system. When we were playing 2nd edition, I always assumed that the way initiative worked was the way we were using it, which is each player rolls 1d10, and they either add their weapon speed factor or their spell casting time to that roll, and then you then go in order from whoever got the lowest result to the highest. And then the DM would roll for, his monsters. If they had similar monsters, they would just all go at the same time, but if they had different monsters in the combat, each monster group would roll separately. So that's the way I always assumed that it worked. That's the way that we played it. It was actually years later, when I would sit down to actually read through the player's handbook, that I came to discover that that was actually an optional rule and not the standard one. The standard rule has the players rolling a single initiative for their side, so all the players would go on a single initiative count, and then the monsters that the DM had would all go at the same time when it became their turn. So you would just flip-flop from side to side, which is similar to how it was done in 1st edition. Basically, what this meant is that if I, as a newer player at that time, who was comfortable with the initiative system the way that it was being used in the group that I was playing with, ended up playing with a different group, they may have used the standard version. There were so many optional rules that if a group used a certain number of them and another group didn't, it could become really confusing, unfortunately, for the new players. And in the end, it really felt like 2nd edition was suffering from sort of an identity crisis. The rules were confusing and counterintuitive, like when I discussed with THAC0 and your bonuses, penalties, and things of that nature. Now, second edition was actually supposedly aimed at a younger, newer consumer base, but new players would often struggle to understand how the core mechanics of the game worked. And the unfortunate thing is that experienced players who were used to the rules, at least in my experiences, did not have a lot of patience to explain things to the newer players and would oftentimes become very frustrated. This meant that second edition AD&D had a huge or a steep learning curve, and in the end I think it drove a large number of people away. Second edition also unfortunately bowed down to pressure from outside groups, like ones that I discussed in my last video, bothered about Dungeons and Dragons, as well as several different religious groups. And they removed elements from the game that had drawn negative criticism in the past. So when we look at the player's handbook, one of the races that was omitted was the half-orc. It was completely gone. Now the reason that they removed the half-orc was, to put it lightly, the act of conceiving a half-orc child was rarely done consensually, unfortunately, and that's sort of the background that they had given to half-orcs, and that was what people had focused on. So in order to avoid endorsing that type of behavior, they completely removed it from the game. They also removed two of the classes that were in the first edition player's handbook. So they had taken out the assassin as well as the monk. Now the assassin, I understand why they removed it, since the class is like literally about murdering. The monk, however, is a little more confusing. I don't really understand why they removed it, because even though I never liked the monk, never really thought that it fit into the more standard European style of the Dungeons & Dragons game, I don't think there was anything about the monk class that was offensive enough to the point where it had to be removed from the game. Now, another big change was one that was done at the hands of several religious groups, and they actually removed demons and devils from the game. Now, the monsters still existed. However, they were replaced by, so devils became the Badazu, and demons became the Tanari. This was done again, like I said, at the hands of religious groups that were pressuring TSR, saying that, having demons and devils in your game promoted devil worship. I don't think what they really realized was that the whole point of having devils and demons in the game was to have them as forces of evil and monsters that you would go out as heroic, characters and defeat. So the whole point of having demons and devils was to fight them, not to work for them. So again, these changes kind of alienated existing players. A lot of them didn't like that they had changed the names of demons and devils, didn't like the dropping of certain classes and races, and it just kind of worked against retaining your previous consumer base, while at the same time the new rules were confusing enough that it also didn't really do anything to capture new audiences, unfortunately, new consumers. TSR would also go and flood the market with a slew of supplements, and rather than focus on strictly, releasing adventures and modules and things like that, they focused really heavily on releasing campaign settings, and way too many, unfortunately, for people to keep up with. So in addition to the standards like your, Greyhawk, Dragonlance, and Forgotten Realms, they released a whole bunch of others, including Mystara. So they had, Mystara, they had things like Red Steel, Maztica, Karatura, Al-Qadim, Spelljammer, Ravenloft, Dark Sun, Planescape, the Council of Worms, and Birthright, just to name a few. Now, many of these settings would actually end up basically being abandoned within a couple of years, so they would release a whole bunch of supplements for them before finding out if they were really all that successful or not, and they would end up scrapping them. I mean, even Planescape, which is one of their more popular settings, only lasted for a couple of years before TSR completely scrapped it. Now, this lack of focus in terms of what they wanted to do for their product lines was only one of the major problems that TSR was faced with. The 1990s saw a fundamental shift in the gaming market. Tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons were going out of style, and in their place, collectible games were becoming the top draw. Games like Magic the Gathering, released by Wizards of the Coast, accomplished to do what TSR had set out to do and ultimately failed to do with 2nd edition D&D, which was to draw a new, younger consumer base. The youth of the 1990s were drawn to the card game, and the collectible nature of it created excitement with each new pack of cards purchased. The anticipation of what cards would come in the pack was, in a lot of ways, just as fun as playing the game itself. TSR watched as Magic the Gathering grew in popularity, while their own sales continued to decline. In an attempt to capitalize on the emerging trend, TSR released their own collectible games. The first attempt was a card game by the name of Spellfire, which was a huge commercial flop. With Spellfire's failure, TSR then released a collectible dice game called Dragon Dice. Vast amounts of finances and resources were poured into producing and marketing Dragon Dice, but it too ultimately failed. Feeling the financial pressure from these losses, TSR re-released 2nd edition core books alongside a series of players' options books in 1995. So these ones with the black covers were part of that 1995 re-release. The players' options book were included titles like Skills and Powers, Combat and Tactics, High Level Play. There was all kinds of these books produced in an attempt to ultimately revitalize the 2nd edition brand, and unfortunately they too failed to do that. TSR, however, would not publicly admit defeat, and even boasted in December 1995 that their sales had improved by 20%. They publicly and famously refuted comments made by then president of Wizards of the Coast, Peter Adkison, when he said that tabletop RPGs were on a steady decline. Lorraine Williams would actually publicly state that, and this is a quote from what she had said, "It is unfortunate that Mr. Atkinson painted with such a broad brush. His statement in regards to TSR is completely inaccurate. We wish Wizards of the Coast well as they divest role-playing and other products from their company. However, their inability to produce successful RPG lines does not necessarily reflect the state of the industry, and certainly not TSR." Those were certainly bold words and defiant words, but unfortunately they couldn't maintain that facade for too long. On December 20th, 1996, TSR laid off a large number of their workforce, and by this point they had gone 6 months without producing any new products, as they were unable to pay their publisher. TSR, once declared one of the fastest growing companies in America, the company that created the tabletop role-playing game industry, was now on the verge of bankruptcy. The future looked bleak for TSR and the Dungeons & Dragons game. Years of financial mismanagement and product releases that nobody had asked for, like the Buck Rogers RPG, high production runs of 1st edition AD&D books, along with the amount of resources and finances sunk into the collectible games like Spellfire and Dragon Dice, ultimately sunk the company. TSR could simply no longer afford to stay in business, and in early 1997, Lorraine Williams sold TSR and its properties and assets to, of all companies, Wizards of the Coast. So the company, one of the companies who helped put TSR out of business, would then go on to purchase the company. In April of 1997, Wizards of the Coast announced their intentions to purchase TSR, and the deal was finalized 2 months later, with TSR being published by Wizards of the Coast for a reported $25 million. The buyout by Wizards of the Coast was almost universally praised. Even Gary Gygax himself publicly approved of the sale. Fans of Dungeons & Dragons were happy that the D&D brand was once again owned by a company that had a passion for gaming, as it was well known that Lorraine Williams and her staff at TSR, after she had taken over management, did not care for the role-playing game itself. They simply saw it as a source of revenue. Now it was owned by a company whose main focus was on creating a game that would be fun to play. Wizards of the Coast would actually continue to produce products using the TSR logo, and in 1997 would begin re-releasing updates of popular 1st edition AD&D modules under their 25th anniversary, silver anniversary product line. So I have one here, White Plume Mountain, which took the original adventures and updated them for the 2nd edition rule set. Now, Wizards of the Coast was not simply content to continue to release the product of 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and of course they began working almost immediately on their version of Dungeons & Dragons. Now, our story doesn't quite end here, because just 2 years after acquiring TSR, Wizards of the Coast were themselves bought out by Hasbro. Hasbro had expressed an interest in purchasing Wizards of the Coast as far back as 1994. However, in September of 1999, Hasbro got serious about it. And at this point, they had purchased Wizards of the Coast for a reported $325 million. So now Wizards of the Coast, and more importantly the Dungeons & Dragons brand, had the backing of a multi-billion-dollar company behind it. So we're going to wrap things up here. That was our look back at 2nd edition. Ultimately, the legacy of 2nd edition isn't really that great. There were a lot of campaign settings that would go on to become fan favorites, like Planescape and things like that, but they simply weren't supported like they should have been. And ultimately, the company just wasn't paying attention to what consumers really wanted, and they thought they could dictate what people wanted. In the end, that failed. TSR went under, and when people really talk about the different editions of Dungeons & Dragons, unfortunately 2nd edition is usually left out of that discussion. 9 times out of 10 when you listen to somebody talk about Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, they're referring to the 1st edition version and not the 2nd edition version. But that's it for our look at 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Be sure to check out part 4 of my retrospective on D&D, when we will discuss Wizards of the Coast first foray into the Dungeons & Dragons brand. We talk about 3rd edition. Be sure to check it out. Again, thank you very much for watching these videos and your support, and we'll see you next time.